Good day and welcome to science class, where we'll be offering various lessons on high school physics, biology, and chemistry topics. So if you find yourself interested in any of these topics, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. For today's lesson, we'll be looking at scientific skills and the scientific method. What are scientific skills? These are skills that are used by scientists when planning and conducting their experiment. Since science is a very broad field with disciplines such as medicine, biology, chemistry, physics, and so forth, there are hundreds of skills that each scientist is going to use depending on their experiment, but we will be focusing on the most common skills. Starting off with observation, which refers to using senses of sight, hearing, touch, smelling, and taste to collect information. But depending on the experiment that the scientist is currently conducting, they will omit certain senses. For example, if you have an unlabeled vial of chemical that you want to find out what chemical this is, you're definitely not going to be touching, smelling, or tasting said chemical since you don't know how dangerous that could be. An example of observation is classification, where you use observations to group objects together based on their similarities and differences. For example, you might use the observation of sight to group objects together that are of the same color. Measurement is an example of a quantitative observation where you use tools with standardized units. Quantitative refers to numerical observations, and an example of measurement would be if you measure the amount of time that it would take to drive from Okahanja to Windhoek. Another skill that scientists use is predicting, which refers to stating the outcome of an event based on prior knowledge gained through experiences or collected data. Another scientific skill is communicating, which refers to gaining and sharing information through talking, listening, and reading. An example of communicating is you watching this video. So while watching this video, you're gaining information about scientific skills. Another very important skill that scientists use is experimenting. So experimenting refers to performing tests to get qualitative or quantitative data. An example of qualitative data is color. So if you find out what color a car is, you've collected qualitative data. And an example of quantitative data is height. So if you figure out how tall the car is, then you've collected quantitative data. And once you've collected the data, now you have to analyze it through the process of data analysis, which refers to interpreting data through analytical and logical reasoning. So let's look at the scientific method. The scientific method refers to steps used to solve problems or conduct experiments. The exact steps may vary depending on the experiment, and steps can be repeated, modified, or reordered. The first step is observation, which leads to questions that help define the purpose of the experiment. Next, you have to do research, which refers to finding out what others have already discovered in relation to your question or experiment. This research will lead to you formulating a hypothesis, which is a prediction of what the outcome of the experiment will be. Then you have to conduct the experiment, which is a detailed procedure designed to test the hypothesis, and the results of these tests called data will be analyzed and used to draw conclusions. The conclusions refer to statements about whether the hypothesis has been accepted or rejected based on the results of the experiment. And these results then have to be shared in order to advance knowledge of the scientific community, and improve future studies. And once you have shared your results, other scientists that want to research on your same topic or question are going to use your results to find out what you have discovered. Let's look at how we can use the scientific method to solve a home robbery. So the first step is we're going to observe the crime scene. So we're going to look for broken windows, broken doors, stolen appliances, and any evidence that might have been left behind. Evidence might include fingerprints, footprints, hair strands, blood, and so forth. Next, we're going to do research. Research might include interviewing the victims so that they can tell us what appliances were stolen. Maybe they could give us a time period for this crime and a motive. Next, we'll interview neighbors, and the information that we might gather witnessed any suspicious vehicle, and maybe they even witnessed where the suspicious person ran to, which might lead to us gathering more evidence. Another way in which we can do research is finding out if similar robberies have been committed recently and who the perpetrators of those robberies were, and then we can interview those people as persons of interest. Once we've gathered all our information, we have to formulate an hypothesis by naming a suspect or establishing a motive. And next, we have to test the evidence against our suspect, which will lead to a conclusion of whether the evidence supports the hypothesis. If so, the suspect might be arrested. And if not, we have to review the evidence and formulate a new hypothesis. Once we have concluded, we have to share our results by announcing either that the suspect was arrested on a news channel, documentary, or even at a trial. So when we're investigating or conducting an experiment, there are various factors that will affect the outcome of the scientific experiment. So those factors are known as variables, and we've identified 3 variables: an independent variable, dependent variable, and controlled variable. Independent variable refers to the variable that is altered during a scientific experiment. The dependent variable is the variable that is being tested or measured during the scientific experiment, and the controlled variable refers to variable that is kept constant during a scientific experiment. So why do we use a controlled variable? We keep the controlled variables constant so that we can ensure that they don't affect our scientific experiment, because we only want to know how the independent variable affects the scientific experiment. So let's look at an example of an experiment where we have independent variables, dependent and control variables. So the example is, does age affect hair growth? So in order to conduct an experiment of how age affects hair growth, we have to figure out what are all the factors that will affect hair growth. And then we have to indicate whether they are independent, dependent, or controlled variables. So before we move on, I would like you to pause this video and write down what those variables are and whether they are independent, dependent, or controlled. Okay, so now that I believe you've done so, let's look at the answers. So remember that the independent variable is the variable that is altered during a scientific experiment. And the reason that we're altering this variable is because we want to see how it affects the dependent variable. So the independent variable in this case will be age, meaning that we're going to use subjects of different age to see how age will affect the dependent variable, which is hair growth. The dependent variable is the variable that we are measuring. So we want to see how age affects hair growth. How does the hair grow of someone that is 12 years old compared to someone that is 50 years old? And we also have controlled variables, which are to be kept constant during the scientific experiment, because we don't want the controlled variables or those factors to affect the results. We only want to know how age will affect the results. And the control variables that we identified are diet, climate, hair type, race, and hair health. Comment which other control variables you have identified. So let's look at how hypotheses and variables relate to each other. Remember that a hypothesis is a prediction of what the study's outcome will be. So let's look at an example. Does the day of the week affect the number of people that visit a mall? So what I would like you to do is pause this video once again and formulate a hypothesis. Formulate the prediction of what you think the study's outcome will be. And then identify the independent, dependent, and control variables. Okay, so the hypothesis that we have formulated is more people visit the mall during weekends compared to weekdays. Write down in the comment section if you have another hypothesis. And the independent variable that we have identified is day of the week. So we will be changing the day of the week. We'll go on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and all the way to Sunday to test the number of people at the mall, which is the dependent variable. And then the controlled variable, which is to be kept constant during a scientific experiment, is the time of day, meaning that each day we'll be going to the mall at the same time in order to make sure that the time of day does not affect our scientific experiment. With that, we've come to the end of our lesson. Please find a link in the description to some practice questions and answers. Like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for watching.